The memory returns to me as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was still a girl, small enough that the world towered above me, yet old enough to recognize the sharp edge of cruelty in a voice meant to guide me. We stood together in the cemetery, the air thick with the raw scent of turned soil, the grass damp under my shoes. My father's grave had only just been covered, the stone marker fresh, the flowers still bright, though already wilting at the edges. I remember clutching the hem of my dress, trying to draw comfort from the silence of the earth around me. It was then my mother leaned down. Her face was partly shadowed by a scarf, but her eyes cut into me with a force I cannot describe. She whispered words so bitter that even the wind seemed to recoil. She told me that one day she would hurt me right there, on my father's grave. At first I thought I had misheard. Surely no mother could say such a thing. But the weight in her tone left no doubt. Those words pierced me deeper than the cold air ever could. Something shifted inside me that day. Trust drained out of me like water through broken glass. I did not fully grasp what she meant, yet my body understood. My hands trembled, my knees locked, my breath came shallow. Even before life began to unfold into pain, I knew that her voice was a cage, and I had already stepped inside. Children are supposed to know safety in their mother's presence. They are supposed to find comfort in a hand that wipes away tears or tucks them into bed. For me, her hand became the hand of fear. After that day, I could never stand near her without feeling the weight of her promise pressing against my chest. When I look back now, I can still hear the crunch of gravel underfoot as we walked away from the grave. I stared at the ground, refusing to meet her gaze, praying silently that she had not truly meant what she said. But the more I prayed, the more I realized those words would live inside me. At home, I found myself retreating to the quiet corners where light slipped through stained glass or where a small wooden crucifix hung above the doorway. I would press my fingers together, whispering prayers I did not fully understand. I begged God to keep me safe, to see me when no one else seemed to notice. My faith was fragile then, more instinct than discipline, but it became the only thing that gave me a sense of being seen. There are nights when I dream of that moment, waking to the sound of her whisper echoing in the dark. Even years later, when I walk the convent halls in silence, I feel the ghost of her words at my shoulder. They are not gone. They have simply transformed. What once was a threat that bound me has become a reminder of what I overcame. But back then, as a child, it only meant dread. The thought that a mother could speak such venom lodged itself into me like a thorn. I began to see the world through the lens of her cruelty. At school, I struggled to focus. My grades slipped. I withdrew from friends. I smiled less and less. Teachers asked questions I never dared answer. At night, I lay awake listening for footsteps in the hallway, the promise of pain woven into every sound. I clung to my father's memory like a lifeline. He had been the one who offered me gentleness, who believed in me, who gave me small glimpses of safety. Losing him was already unbearable. To lose him and then inherit my mother's threat felt like being robbed twice over. I longed to speak to him, to sit by the grave and tell him what she had said, but fear sealed my lips. Silence became my survival. Even as I tell you this now, as a woman who has walked many roads since, I can still feel the little girl I was, standing frozen in that graveyard. The sun glowed faintly on the horizon, but it offered no warmth. The grave before me did not only hold my father's body, it became the place where my mother buried my sense of safety. I reveal my name now, though not as I would have spoken it then. I am Lucille Warren, and this is the story of how I carried a mother's threat in my bones, how it shaped every shadow of my youth, and how it eventually led me not to despair, but to a calling. That day did not end when we left the cemetery gates. It became the opening note of a long, sorrowful song. The promise she made haunted me through every year that followed, shaping the choices I made, the secrets I kept, and the silence I endured. Yet it also became the moment when a fragile seed of faith was planted in me. Because when the one who should have loved me most spoke words of harm, I turned to someone greater. Even if at first I did not know his name well enough to trust him fully. Looking back now, I see that day not only as the beginning of pain, but also as the beginning of my search for refuge. I did not yet know where that refuge would lead me. I could not have imagined the convent walls or the vows I would one day take. All I knew then was that a mother's promise could break a child, but a whisper of faith might still hold her together. And so the story began, not with safety, not with love, but with a chilling vow at a graveside. It was a vow that would twist through my childhood like a dark thread, binding me in silence until the day it finally broke open. But for now, I leave you standing beside that grave with me, hearing the whisper that changed everything. After that day at the grave, the shadow of my mother's words seemed to stretch across everything I touched. I was still only a child, but I began to carry myself as though danger lurked around every corner. The house that should have been a refuge often felt like a stage where I had to measure every movement, every word, to avoid awakening the storm that lived inside her. There were mornings when the light spilled gently through the curtains, and, for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe it might be a peaceful day. I would dress for school, braid my hair carefully, and clutch my worn satchel like it could shield me. But even then, a single glance from my mother could shatter that fragile hope. Her moods shifted like wind through trees, sometimes quiet and indifferent, other times sharp and cutting. I never knew which version I would face. School became both escape and burden. On the playground, I would hear the laughter of other children, light and unguarded, and I would wonder what it felt like to live without constant fear. I tried to join in, to mimic their games, but inside I was always waiting for the bell to ring, signaling that I had to return home to the silence of suspicion. Teachers noticed I had grown withdrawn. They asked gentle questions, but I answered, with rehearsed smiles, afraid of what might happen if my mother discovered I had spoken too freely. The silence she demanded was not always enforced with words. Sometimes it was just the weight of her gaze, steady and unyielding, reminding me that I belonged to her control. Sometimes it was a slammed door, a dish broken against the counter, or the hiss of her voice warning me what would happen if I dared to betray her secrets. Those moments settled in me like stones in a river, pulling me deeper into fear. I found myself turning more and more toward the small symbols of faith around me. A crucifix hung in our hallway, the wood darkened from years of dust and touch. I would pause beneath it, tracing the outline of Christ's body with my eyes, wondering if he saw me. At night, I whispered prayers into the darkness, sometimes so quietly I could barely hear myself. I prayed for my father, for the comfort of his presence, for the chance to feel once more the safety of his embrace. But most of all, I prayed for deliverance from the house, from the threats, from the silence that strangled me. Despite my prayers, the weight of fear pressed down heavier as I grew older. My mother's control seeped into places beyond our home. She dictated where I went, who I saw, even how I carried myself. At times I felt less like a daughter and more like a shadow attached to her will. And yet, to those outside, she could appear as any ordinary mother, stern, perhaps, but not monstrous. That facade made it harder for me to imagine ever being believed if I spoke out. There were small moments of escape, ones I clung to desperately. I remember afternoons spent lingering at the church after school, pretending to help with tidying the pews just so I could breathe a little longer in a place that felt safe. The scent of wax candles, the echo of footsteps on stone, even the silence of the altar, it all gave me a sense of peace I could not find at home. Though I was only a child, those moments planted seeds that would one day grow into something larger than I could then imagine. But in those years, peace was fleeting. At night, I often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying my mother's vow at the grave. I wondered if she still meant it, if she was counting down the days until she would make good on her promise. The thought gnawed at me, leaving me, restless and weary, before morning ever came. What unsettled me most was how her words began to shape the way I saw myself. I started to believe that perhaps I truly was meant for harm, that perhaps there was something in me that invited cruelty. I was too young to understand that this was not truth, only the poison of her control. Yet at that time, it felt like destiny. I carried shame without even knowing its name. There were times when my imagination became both a comfort and a curse. I would picture my father returning, walking through the door, lifting me into his arms. I imagined him telling me I was safe now, that no one would hurt me again. But when I opened my eyes, I saw only the emptiness he left behind and the looming figure of the woman who had promised me pain. That contrast broke something inside me, pushing me further into silence. Still, even in the darkest corners of childhood, a flicker of resilience stirred. I found ways to protect small pieces of myself, through writing in secret notebooks, through daydreams of freedom, through the quiet prayers I whispered when no one was listening. I began to understand that survival was not only about enduring, but also about guarding that small spark of hope within me. Looking back, I see now how those years prepared me, though I would not have chosen the path. The silence I carried taught me to listen deeply. The fear I lived with taught me to recognize the pain of others. And the faint comfort I found in faith became the first steps on a journey I could never have predicted. Yet at that time, I did not see any of it as preparation. All I knew was that I was a child living under the shadow of a promise made at a grave, navigating each day with careful steps, praying I would not trigger the storm again. It was a heavy burden for a young girl to carry, but it was the only life I knew. What I did not realize then was that this silence, this constant vigilance, could not last forever. A breaking point was coming, one that would force everything hidden into the light. The silence that wrapped around my childhood was not merely the absence of words. It was a living presence, a chain that bound me tighter with every year that passed. After the graveyard promise and the years of shadows that followed, I learned to keep secrets buried so deep that even I sometimes questioned if they were real. But the body remembers, and the heart remembers, even when the tongue refuses to speak. I became skilled at hiding. At school, I wore a mask of politeness. I nodded. When teachers asked if everything was all right, scribbled answers quickly on tests, and tried not to draw too much attention. My classmates whispered among themselves, wondering why I seemed so quiet, why I rarely joined in their laughter. They could not see the weight pressing on me, the invisible warning carved into my memory. Do not tell, do not betray. At home, the kiai. Silence was enforced not just by words but by fear. My mother's eyes could command obedience without a single syllable. A slammed door, a sudden silence in the kitchen, the echo of something breaking. Those were enough reminders. She carried authority in her very presence, and I carried terror in mine. I began to feel the cost of silence in my body. Nights stretched, long, filled with shallow breathing and restless tossing. Sometimes I woke with my heart pounding, certain that she stood just outside my door. I carried exhaustion into the daylight, stumbling through lessons at school, my mind foggy and heavy. Teachers scolded me for inattention, but they did not know the nightmares that drained me before dawn. Faith was the only thread that gave me a fragile sense of endurance. I clung to whispered prayers like lifelines. Kneeling beside my bed, I begged God to hear what I could not tell anyone else. The words were often broken, my voice trembling, but in that trembling, I felt a strange closeness to him, as if he, too, lived in the quiet places, listening even when the world chose not. Yet silence carried another cost, shame. Because I did not speak, I began to believe that perhaps the secret was mine to bear, that somehow it revealed something broken in me. I thought perhaps I was different from other children, marked in ways no one else could see. Shame became the second chain, binding me as tightly as fear. I noticed how shame crept into my posture. I avoided mirrors, ducked my head when people spoke, and kept my voice soft, as if the world did not deserve to hear it. Even when I wanted to scream, I swallowed the sound. My silence became not only survival, but identity. I was the girl who kept secrets, who disappeared into the background, who made herself small so the storm would pass over her. But storms rarely pass over forever. Instead, they gather strength. The silence I carried began to erode the foundation of my life. My schoolwork continued to falter. My friendships dissolved one by one, because I could never explain why I avoided sleepovers, why I left early, why I seemed so distracted. Even church, which had once felt like refuge, became a place where I sat stiff in the pew, afraid that if I closed my eyes too long, the memories would flood through. I think now of how children adapt to survive. I created small rituals of safety, counting steps as I walked home, memorizing escape routes in the house, clutching my rosary until my palms ached. Those rituals did not change my circumstances, but they gave me an illusion of control, a tiny island of certainty in a sea of chaos. Still, deep inside, a part of me longed to be seen. I wanted someone to notice the cracks in my smile, the tremor in my voice. I wanted a teacher, a neighbor, anyone to press past my rehearsed assurances and say, "Tell me the truth." But no one did, and so the silence thickened like a fog. Looking back, I realize how much that silence shaped me. It taught me to listen before I ever learned to speak my own truth. It taught me to sense the emotions of others, to hear what was hidden beneath their words. Those lessons, painful as they were, would later become tools in my ministry. But at the time, they only felt like burdens too heavy for a child to bear. The turning point began slowly, almost imperceptibly. My body, already weary from carrying secrets, began to falter. I fainted once at school, collapsing in the hallway as startled classmates gathered around. my vision blurred, my limbs weak, and for a moment I thought I was dying. But instead of release, I awoke to more questions. Questions I was too afraid to answer. The fainting became harder to explain away, and soon the silence I had carried for so long began to unravel, thread by thread. In those moments, as fear and shame closed tighter around me, I began to sense that something was shifting. Secrets cannot remain buried forever. The body speaks when the mouth refuses. The heart cries out when the mind stays quiet. And though I did not yet know it, the silence that had defined my childhood was nearing its breaking point. But before the breaking, there was still more silence to endure. Still more nights of prayer whispered into the dark. Still more mornings of masking pain with forced smiles. The chain had not yet snapped, but the first cracks had formed. I carried those cracks with me, uncertain what they meant, afraid of what might happen when the truth finally spilled into the open. All I knew was that my mother's promise had bound me in silence for years. But even chains, no matter how strong, weaken when pulled too tight. The day was coming when the silence would shatter, when secrets would no longer stay hidden. I did not know when or how, but I felt it in the air around me, like the heaviness before a storm breaks open. The body can carry only so much before it begins to betray the secrets the heart has tried to contain. After years of silence, after years of whispered prayers in the dark, my own body finally cried out for me. What began with fainting spells soon grew into something far harder to ignore. I remember the first time it happened clearly. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and pencil shavings. I was bent over a worksheet, my mind foggy, my chest heavy, when the world tilted sideways. I remember a sharp gasp from the girl sitting beside me, then blackness. When I awoke, I was lying on the cool floor tiles, surrounded by faces staring down in alarm. My teacher knelt beside me, her hands trembling as she asked if I was all right. I wanted to say yes, to assure her I was fine, but my tongue felt thick, my lips heavy. Instead, I nodded, forcing the lie I had rehearsed countless times before. That day should have been a wake-up call, but instead I buried it like all the others. I told myself it was nothing, that perhaps I had skipped breakfast or stood too quickly. But deep down, I knew. I knew the silence I carried had begun to carve itself into my body, and no amount of pretending could erase it. The fainting spells grew more frequent. At church, during Mass, I would suddenly feel the world dimming, my knees trembling as if they could no longer bear the weight of my secrets. At home, I would stumble into walls, dizzy, my vision blurred. My mother dismissed it with a wave of her hand, accusing me of exaggerating for attention. Her denial only drove me deeper into fear, because if she would not acknowledge it, who would? Eventually, the episodes could no longer be ignored. One morning at school, I collapsed so completely that I was taken to the hospital. I remember the smell of antiseptic, the beeping of machines, the thin blanket draped across my body as though it could shield me from the truth. Nurses moved quickly around me, and doctors asked questions I was too afraid to answer. They looked for causes, illness, malnutrition, stress, and though I remained silent, my body offered evidence that words could not. A social worker visited my hospital room one afternoon. She pulled a chair close to my bed, her eyes steady, her voice gentle. "Lucille," she said softly, "you're safe here. You can tell me what's happening." My heart pounded against my ribs, my throat ached with the urge to speak, but fear pressed down harder. I shook my head, insisting I was fine, insisting nothing was wrong. But the way her eyes lingered told me she did not believe me. When my mother arrived at the hospital, the tension in the room was like a thunderstorm waiting to break. She insisted there was nothing wrong with me, that I was dramatic, that doctors were overreacting. She smiled at the nurses, a tight, controlled smile, but her eyes flickered with warning whenever they caught mine. The promise she had made at my father's grave seemed to echo in that sterile room, reminding me of the consequences of betrayal. But the truth has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how tightly sealed. Tests revealed inconsistencies. Examinations showed signs of stress that could not be explained away. The doctors pressed harder. The social worker returned again and again, and slowly the walls I had built began to tremble. The breaking point came one evening when the weight of fear finally met the strength of exhaustion. I lay in that hospital bed, the fluorescent lights humming above me, when I realized I could no longer keep the silence alive. It was killing me, not only in spirit but in body. I began to cry, quietly at first, then harder, until the sound filled the room. A nurse sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine, waiting without pressing. In that moment, I whispered pieces of truth, fragments at first, broken sentences. I did not reveal everything, but it was enough. Enough for the nurses to understand that the danger was not imaginary, that the shadows of my home were real. The next day, I was called into a small room with doctors, the social worker, and my mother. The air was electric, thick with accusation and denial. The social worker spoke gently but firmly, asking direct questions, pressing for answers. My mother's voice rose in anger, her face twisted in fury, her words sharp and cutting. She denied, deflected, accused me of lies. But the evidence on my body, the tremors in my voice, and the persistence of those who cared finally broke through her mask. That confrontation was chaos. Shouting, tears, slammed fists on the table. I sat trembling, caught between relief that the truth was surfacing and terror of what would follow. My mother's eyes burned into me with the silent warning I knew too well. Yet for the first time, she was not in complete control. Others had seen enough. Others were stepping in. When I was told that I would not be going home that night, a strange mixture of dread and relief washed over me. I had no idea where I would go, no idea what the future held, but I knew one thing with certainty. The silence had been broken. The chains that bound me were cracked open, and though I feared what my mother might do, I also felt the first fragile breath of freedom. That hospital room, with its sterile walls and flickering lights, became the place where my childhood silence ended. It was not the end of my struggle, far from it, but it was the moment when the secret I carried could no longer be hidden. It was the moment when others began to see what I had endured. I left the hospital with trembling legs and a pounding heart, stepping into a world that suddenly felt uncertain, but alive. For the first time in years, the weight of silence was not entirely mine to bear. And though the path ahead was unclear, I knew something had shifted forever. The breaking point had come, and with it, the first step toward a future I had not dared to imagine. Leaving the hospital did not bring peace. If anything, it felt like stepping from one storm into another. The silence that had once kept my home intact was gone, and in its place came a flood of accusations, denials, and rage. The truth was too large now, too visible to be buried again, and my mother's fury erupted with a force that shook every wall of our house. I remember the evening we returned. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn tight though the sun had not fully set. My mother's posture was rigid, her arms crossed like iron bars across her chest. A social worker had accompanied me home, determined to ensure my safety until further arrangements could be made. Yet even her presence could not soften the venom in my mother's glare. "You see what you've done?" my mother hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "Lies. All lies. You've ruined this family." Her words struck like blows, each one a denial of the pain I had carried for years. She called me ungrateful, dramatic, cursed the very breath I took. The social worker tried to steady the conversation, speaking calmly, reminding her that this was about my well-being. But my mother's anger only grew. She pounded the arm of the chair, her voice rising, accusing everyone in the room of conspiring against her. The walls seemed to tremble with the force of her rage, and I sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded tight in my lap, trying to keep from collapsing beneath the weight of her fury. What struck me most in that moment was not only her denial, but the way she twisted every word, painting herself as the victim, me as the villain. "She's destroying me," she cried, as though my broken silence had been a weapon aimed at her heart. "She wants attention. She wants to shame me. She'll say anything." But even as her words echoed, I could feel a change in the room. The social worker did not flinch. She listened, yes, but her gaze returned to me, steady and unwavering, as though she knew the truth was not in the volume of my mother's voice, but in the tremor of my own. For the first time, I realized there were people who saw past the facade, people who could not be blinded by her fury. That confrontation spiraled late into the night. My mother's accusations poured like a flood, spilling over everything, my father's memory, my schooling, even my faith. She mocked the prayers she had once taught me, sneering that God had abandoned us long ago. Her cruelty left me trembling, but strangely, it also lit a small flame inside me. If she could mock the very thing that gave me hope, then perhaps it proved she was terrified of losing her grip. When the shouting finally ended, it was not because her anger had burned out, but because others had stepped in. The social worker stood firm, reminding her that my safety was not negotiable. Neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the noise, whispering among themselves. My mother slammed a door in fury, retreating to her room, leaving behind an echoing silence, broken only by my shallow breathing. The following days blurred into one long confrontation. Relatives arrived, some siding with her, insisting that I must be exaggerating, others speaking in hushed tones about things they had always suspected but never voiced. It felt as though the family had split into factions, those who wanted to preserve appearances at any cost, and those who, though hesitant, began to question whether I had been telling the truth all along. For me, each hour was a test of endurance. I sat through questioning eyes, whispered arguments, slammed doors, and long silences that carried as much accusation as words. My mother refused to look at me except to glare. She reminded me of her graveyard promise, not with words, but with a look so full of hatred that it pierced deeper than any shout. Yet through that chaos, I began to feel something unexpected. Relief. For years, I had carried the secret alone, and though the exposure brought fury and judgment, it also meant I was no longer entirely alone. The social worker checked in daily. Teachers called with concern. Even a kind neighbor slipped me notes of encouragement, simple words like, "You are brave and you are seen." Those small gestures became lifelines in a storm determined to drown me. The climax came during one final meeting, when authorities sat with my mother in our living room, papers spread across the table. She was told plainly that I could not remain under her care, that arrangements would be made for me to live elsewhere. Her rage erupted once again, louder, sharper, almost desperate. She shouted that they could not take her daughter from her, that I belonged to her, that I was nothing without her control. But I remember the stillness that followed when one official looked her in the eye and said, "Lucille deserves safety. This is not negotiable." In that sentence, I felt the weight of years shift. For once, someone had spoken on my behalf. Someone had put words to the truth I could not carry alone. My mother's response was chilling. She stood, her face twisted, her voice low but filled with venom. "You will regret this," she said, her eyes fixed on me. It was not the loud rage that terrified me most, but the quiet certainty in her tone. Yet even then, surrounded by others who refused to let me face her alone, I realized something vital. Her power was no longer absolute. That night, as I packed a small bag under supervision, I glanced around the house one last time. Every corner carried memories of fear, yet leaving them behind felt like peeling away chains I had worn for too long. I did not know what awaited me, but I knew the silence was broken, and no matter how much she shouted or threatened, she could not force it back into place. The family had erupted, the walls had shaken, and the life I had known was ending. Its place, a fragile hope was beginning to rise, fragile but real. I stepped outside into the cool night air, my small bag clutched to my chest, and for the first time in years, I breathed deeply, knowing that the next chapter was about to begin. The night I left my mother's house, the air felt different. Cooler, lighter, as though even the sky had exhaled after years of holding its breath. I clutched a small bag with only a few clothes and a worn rosary tucked carefully inside, unsure if I was stepping into safety or deeper into the unknown, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was leaving behind the place where my silence had been chained. Two officials from child services waited by the car, their faces kind but serious. They spoke in gentle tones, reminding me that I was not alone, that I was being taken somewhere safe. I nodded, though fear still knotted itself tight in my stomach. The car door shut with a heavy thud, and as the engine started, I looked out the window one last time. The house grew smaller in the distance, its windows dark, its walls holding years of shadows I would not return to. Our drive took us to the edge of town, where a parish stood quietly beneath tall trees. Its stone walls glowed softly under the moonlight, the cross atop its steeple pointing heavenward like a silent promise. Beside the parish was a convent, modest but warm, its windows lit as though waiting for me. My escort explained that I would stay there until a more permanent placement could be decided. At the mention of nuns, something in me stirred. I had always found comfort in the quiet reverence of their presence at Mass, though I never imagined I might live among them. When we arrived, two sisters greeted me at the door. One was older, her face lined with years but softened with compassion, her hands steady as she reached for mine. The other was younger, her eyes bright with gentle welcome. They did not bombard me with questions. They simply guided me inside, offering warmth and silence in place of the chaos I had fled. The scent of bread drifted faintly from the kitchen, and the wooden floors creaked softly beneath my shoes as though whispering, "You are safe here." That first night, I was shown to a small room, a narrow bed, a desk, and a crucifix hanging on the wall above the pillow. It was nothing extravagant, but it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in years, I closed a door without fear that someone would burst through it in anger. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my rosary, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Tears came quickly, soaking the pillow as I lay down. Yet they were different from the tears I had shed before. These tears carried not only sorrow, but a fragile relief. Still, safety did not erase fear overnight. I woke several times that night, startled by every creak of the convent's old wood. My body had been trained to anticipate danger, and unlearning that instinct would take time. Each time I woke, I turned my gaze toward the crucifix on the wall, reminding myself that I was no longer in my mother's house, that I was surrounded by women who had chosen lives of faith and service. Slowly, my breathing calmed, and sleep returned. The days that followed began to build a fragile rhythm. The sisters gave me chores, simple tasks like sweeping the halls or helping in the garden. At first, my hands trembled as I worked, afraid I might be reprimanded for the smallest mistake, but no harsh words came. Instead, when I faltered, I was met with patience. "It's all right, Lucille," Sister Agnes would say softly, her voice steady as stone. "Take your time." Those words felt foreign. "It's all right." I had never known such grace in my mother's house, where mistakes were weapons used against me. Here, mistakes were treated as part of being human. Slowly, I allowed myself to believe it. At school, things were still difficult. Though the sisters ensured I attended a nearby Catholic school, I remained guarded. I sat in the back, avoided questions, and kept my head low. But even there, small changes began to appear. A teacher noticed when I completed my assignments carefully. A classmate offered to share notes without demanding anything in return. Those small gestures began to chip away at the belief that I was destined only for harm. The sisters encouraged me to join them in evening prayers. At first I hesitated, afraid my voice would falter among theirs. But as the chanting filled the chapel, steady and unwavering, I added my whisper to theirs. The sound of my own voice joining in was enough to bring tears to my eyes, for the first time. I was not praying alone in the dark. I was part of something larger, something safe. Yet even in safety, the past followed me. Letters arrived from my mother, filled with venom disguised as longing. She accused me of betrayal, begged for me to return, then threatened me in the same breath. The sisters shielded me from most of her words, but the ones I read left my hands, shaking. Her promise at the grave echoed in every line. The difference now was that I was no longer alone in facing it. Sister Agnes sat with me one evening, her hands folded calmly as I wept over a letter. "She does not define you," she said gently. "Your life is more than her words." That truth was like light breaking through clouds. I clung to it, even when doubt whispered otherwise. In time, the convent became more than shelter. It became home. The sisters did not erase my pain, but they gave me space to breathe, to begin healing. I began to see that survival was not only about escaping harm, but about learning to live beyond it. I still carried fear, still woke from nightmares, still felt the chain of silence tug at me. But here, in this place of prayer and compassion, the links began to weaken. I swept floors, knelt in prayer, studied my lessons, and little by little, I began to feel human again. The flight from my mother's house was not the end of my struggle, but it was the beginning of something new. It was the first real step toward freedom, the first taste of safety. And though I did not yet know it, Those convent walls were not only protecting me, they were quietly shaping me into the woman I would one day become. Life within the convent slowly wove itself into a rhythm that began to soften the edges of my fear. At first, every creak of the old wooden floors startled me. Every unexpected knock on the door sent a shiver through my body. Yet the days passed with a steadiness I had never known before. There was no shouting, no sudden eruption of anger, no venomous promises to haunt me. Instead, there was order, quiet, and compassion. It was in this fragile peace that the first seeds of healing began to take root. The sisters gave me chores that seemed small but carried hidden meaning. Sweeping the chapel each morning became more than a task. It was a ritual of cleansing, a way to brush away not only dust, but the shadows of the night before. Helping in the garden taught me patience. As I watched tiny seeds press through the soil, fragile yet determined, I began to see myself in those plants, rooted in dark earth, uncertain at first, but stretching upward toward light. Counseling sessions became another space where cracks of healing appeared. A kind woman, not much older than the younger sisters, sat across from me each week. She asked gentle questions, never pressing too hard, giving me space to answer in my own time. At first, I could only manage fragments. My voice caught, my eyes darted away. But over time, words that had been locked inside me for years began to emerge. I spoke of fear, of silence, of the promise made at a grave. Saying it aloud felt like peeling back scars, painful yet strangely freeing. She listened without judgment, never recoiling from the weight of my words. Instead, she reminded me that none of what had happened was my fault. That simple sentence, repeated often, began to chip away at the belief I had carried for so long, that perhaps I deserved the pain, that perhaps I was somehow marked for harm. Her words did not erase those beliefs instantly, but they planted truth in me, a truth that began to sprout slowly, quietly, like a seed beneath soil. School, too, became less frightening. I still sat quietly, still hesitant to raise my hand, but I no longer carried the same paralyzing shame. A teacher who had noticed my diligence began to encourage me, praising the effort I put into assignments. For the first time, I saw a reflection of myself that was not broken but capable. That reflection gave me strength. The convent chapel became my refuge. I loved the way candlelight danced across stone walls, the way the sisters' voices rose together in prayer. At first I whispered timidly, afraid my voice did not belong among theirs. But over time my voice grew steadier, and I discovered something powerful. When I prayed aloud in unison with others, my loneliness lessened. The silence that had once imprisoned me was being replaced by a different kind of silence, a sacred quiet filled with presence and hope. The sisters never pushed me to speak of my past, but they showed me by their actions that love could be steady, patient, and safe. Sister Agnes, with her lined face and steady hands, became like a sheltering oak tree, firm, rooted, dependable. Sister Mary, younger and quick to smile, reminded me that gentleness could be strong too. They guided me not through force, but through example, teaching me that life did not have to be lived under constant fear. Still, healing was not without struggle. Nightmares continued to visit me. In the darkness, I often heard echoes of my mother's voice, the graveyard promise repeating itself in whispers. I would wake with tears on my cheeks, my body tense. But here, I did not face those nights alone. Sometimes a sister would sit beside my bed, reading softly from the Psalms until I calmed. Other times, I would creep into the chapel and kneel before the crucifix, clutching my rosary, pouring out my fear to the one I hoped was listening. Each time, the panic subsided a little sooner. The comfort lasted a little longer. As weeks turned into months, I began to rediscover pieces of myself I thought had been buried forever. I remembered that I loved to read, so I spent afternoons in the convent library, losing myself in stories that carried me to worlds far from my own. I discovered a talent for writing, filling notebooks with reflections and prayers. These pages became a safe place where my thoughts could roam freely, where my voice mattered, even if no one else ever read the words. The greatest change, however, came in how I began to see God. As a child, I prayed from fear, desperate for rescue. Now, in the stillness of the convent, I began to pray from longing. I wanted to know Him, not only as Savior, but as Father, as friend, as the steady presence my earthly father had once been. Slowly, I began to trust that He had not abandoned me, that perhaps even through my suffering, He had been guiding me here, to this place of safety. I still carried scars, invisible but real. I still battled moments of doubt, times when shame whispered louder than truth. But for the first time, I also carried hope. It was small, fragile, but alive. Hope that I could build a life not defined by my mother's vow, but by my own choices. Hope that I could be more than the girl who had been silenced. Looking back, I see that these were the years when healing first began to take root. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible, like the steady growth of a seedling in a garden. But little by little, I learned to breathe without fear, to speak without shame, to live without believing I was destined only for harm. These were the years that prepared me for the calling that would later shape my life. I did not know then that I would one day take vows as a nun. I did not yet see the full picture of my future. But I began to sense that my pain was not the end of the story. Something greater awaited me, something that would turn my scars into a source of compassion for others. And so, as I swept chapel floors, tended gardens, whispered prayers, and filled notebooks, I was not only healing. I was also being shaped, slowly and quietly, into the woman I would become. The years I spent within the convent as a girl were the soil where the first seeds of healing grew. Yet healing is never only about what is left behind. It is also about what lies ahead. Slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to walk a new path, one that would lead me not just away from fear, but toward a calling I had never imagined for myself. By the time I reached my late teens, the convent had become more than shelter. It had become home. I moved with the rhythms of its life as naturally as breathing, morning prayers, shared meals, the sound of bells calling us to the chapel. My days were filled with study, work, and reflection, and though the scars of my childhood still marked me, I no longer lived defined by them. Education opened windows I had once believed were forever closed. In the classroom, I discovered a sharpness of mind I had not known I carried. Books became companions, not just stories to escape into, but teachers that expanded my world. History, literature, theology, all revealed that life could be larger, richer than the narrow prison my mother had once created. For the first time, I began to imagine a future shaped not by fear, but by choice. Yet even as I studied, a deeper stirring took place in my soul. Every time I knelt in the chapel, Every time I joined the sisters in hymns that rose like steady waves, I felt something awakening in me. It was not only comfort, it was purpose. I began to sense that my life was not only to be rescued, but to be given. That the pain I had endured might be transformed into compassion, that my scars might become the language through which I could love others. There were moments when this calling frightened me. To give my life fully to God felt daunting. I had spent so many years fighting for survival. How could I now imagine surrender? Yet the more I prayed, the clearer it became. The same God who had been with me in silence, who had listened to my whispered prayers when no one else would, was now inviting me to step fully into his service. Of course, the past did not vanish. Letters still came from my mother, some pleading, others filled with venom. Each one shook me, reopened wounds I thought had closed. The sisters encouraged me to set them aside, but sometimes I read them, my hands trembling. She accused me of betraying her, begged me to return, then reminded me of her promise at my father's grave. Those words still had the power to pierce, but slowly I began to see them differently. They were not chains anymore. They were reminders of the prison I had left behind. One evening, I sat with Sister Agnes in the convent garden, a letter still trembling in my hand. "She will never change," I whispered, my voice breaking. Her words still feel like fire. Sister Agnes placed her hand over mine, her eyes calm. "Then let them burn away what is not meant to remain," she said. "Do not let them burn you, child. Let them refine you." Those words stayed with me. I realized then that I could not control my mother's heart, nor could I erase the wounds she had caused. But I could decide what her words would mean in my life. They could chain me, or they could push me further into the arms of the one who promised freedom. By the time I turned 18, the decision to pursue religious life no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a calling. I applied to enter formally, trembling as I signed the papers, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The day I was accepted, I wept. Not because I believed my journey of healing was complete, but because I finally believed my life could be more than survival. The early years of formation were not easy. The discipline of religious life was rigorous. Early mornings, long hours of study, the challenge of community living. But each challenge carried meaning. Where my mother's control had once suffocated me, the structure of convent life steadied me. It was not control. It was order that gave freedom rather than stole it. There were days I questioned myself. Could I really live this life forever? Could I keep my vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience? In those moments of doubt, I returned to the chapel, knelt before the crucifix, and remembered the child who once whispered prayers in the dark, begging God to notice her. That child had been heard. That child had been led here, and that memory gave me courage to keep going. Letters from my mother continued to arrive, though I read fewer of them now. I no longer needed her approval to define me. Once, I even burned one of her letters in the fireplace, watching the flames consume her threats until only ash remained. As I watched the smoke rise, I whispered, "You do not own me anymore." It was a quiet act of defiance, but also one of freedom. Years later, when I took my final vows, I stood in the chapel wearing white, my voice steady as I promised my life to God. Tears blurred my vision, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fulfillment. The girl who had once cowered in silence was now standing openly, declaring her choice, her purpose, her freedom. Looking back now, I see that those years were the beginning of my true path. They did not erase the scars or silence the echoes of my past, but they gave them new meaning. What had once been a story of fear was becoming a story of calling. What had once been the weight of chains was becoming the strength of wings. I had not yet faced the final confrontation with my mother, nor fully closed that chapter of my life. But I was no longer the child who trembled in silence. I was Lucille Warren, a woman learning to walk in freedom, a woman called to serve, a woman whose path had only just begun. Even after I took my vows, after I embraced a life of prayer and service, the past never vanished entirely. Healing does not erase memory. It teaches you how to live with it. For years, I carried my mother's voice in echoes, her words lingering, like shadows across bright walls. I had learned to rise above them, but they never fully disappeared. And deep inside, I knew there would come a time when I would have to face her, not for reconciliation, but for closure. The opportunity arrived when word reached me that my mother's health was failing. I was older by then, settled into my vocation, respected among the sisters, known for compassion that often drew others to confide in me. Yet hearing of her frailty sent a chill through me. Part of me longed to ignore it, to leave the past buried. Another part of me, the part that had once trembled at her graveyard vow, whispered that I could not move forward without facing the one who had first chained me in silence. I prayed for weeks before deciding. I knelt in the chapel late at night, candlelight flickering across stone, asking God for wisdom. The answer came not in a thunderous revelation, but in a quiet stirring. Go, but do not go to change her. Go to free yourself. Those words settled me. I knew then that this confrontation would not be about her repentance. It would be about my release. When I finally traveled to see her, I carried no expectations. The small house where she now lived seemed shrunken, weary, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust. Inside, I found her older, frailer, but her eyes still sharp, still capable of piercing through me. Time had changed her body, but it had not softened her spirit. She greeted me not with warmth, but with suspicion. "So, you came back," she muttered, her voice raspy. "After all your betrayal, after all the lies you told about me." The venom was still there, though weakened by age. For a moment I felt the old fear rise in me, the trembling of the child I once was. But then I remembered where I stood. I was no longer that girl. I was a woman, a nun, a servant of God. I breathed deeply and steadied myself. "I came," I said softly, "because I needed to see you. Not to fight, not to argue, but to speak the truth aloud." Her laughter was bitter. "Truth? You never knew the truth. You only knew how to shame me." The words cut, but they did not wound as deeply as they once would have. I realized in that moment that she no longer had the same power over me. Her accusations were echoes of an old song, one I no longer needed to dance to. I told her what her promise at the grave had done to me, how it had carved fear into my bones, how it had haunted my every step, how it had nearly broken me. I spoke not with anger, but with calm, my voice steady, even as tears filled my eyes. She shifted in her chair, uncomfortable, muttering that I was exaggerating, that I was ungrateful. But I continued, not for her acceptance, but for my own freedom. At one point, her eyes softened, just for a moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of regret, But just as quickly, the walls returned and she looked away. I realized then that whether she acknowledged the truth or not no longer mattered. I had spoken it. I had released it from the silence where it had lived for so long. Before I left, she tried once more to twist the knife. "You'll never escape me," she said quietly, her voice like a dying ember of the fire that once consumed me. I met her gaze, and for the first time did not flinch. "I already have," I replied. My words were not shouted, not angry, but filled with a peace that startled even me. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt the weight of years lifting. The confrontation had not ended with reconciliation, but it had ended with clarity. I could not change her. I could not erase what had been done, but I no longer needed her acknowledgement to be free. I had already chosen freedom the day I left her house. This visit only confirmed what God had been teaching me all along. Forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not excusing. Forgiveness is setting down the burden you were never meant to carry. I walked away from that house with steady steps, breathing in the air like someone who had been underwater too long. For the first time, the echo of her voice did not follow me. Instead, I heard a new voice within, quiet but sure. "You are mine. You are free." That confrontation marked the closing of a chapter I had carried for decades. It did not erase the scars, but it sealed them. It did not reconcile us, but it released me. I knew then that the past would no longer define my future. I was Lucille Warren, no longer a child bound by silence, but a woman who had found her voice, her faith, and her calling. When I returned to the convent after seeing my mother for the last time, I felt as though I had crossed a threshold. Something inside me had shifted. For years, I had lived with the echo of her voice, with the fear that her words might always define me. But after that confrontation, I realized the echo was fading. Her vow at my father's grave had haunted me for decades, but it no longer held me captive. I was free, not because she had released me, but because I had chosen to release myself. Life in the cloister settled back into its quiet rhythm, yet it felt different now. Morning bells still rang, calling us to prayer. The scent of incense still drifted through the chapel. The candles still flickered against stone walls, casting their soft glow. But now I carried those sights and sounds not as fragile lifelines, but as anchors. My faith was no longer simply survival. It had become my life's foundation. Each day, I found myself drawn deeper into service. I worked in the garden, teaching younger children who visited from the parish how to plant seeds and tend to the earth. I taught them the patience I had once learned in silence, showing them how something small could grow into something strong. I helped in the infirmary, sitting with the sick and elderly, listening to their stories. Their pain did not frighten me, it felt familiar, and in listening, I could offer them the compassion I had once longed for. I often thought about my father. Though his life had been cut short, his memory had been a thread of safety in my darkest years. I wondered if he would be proud to see me now, living not under fear, but under vows freely chosen. In prayer, I sometimes spoke to him as though he could hear me, telling him how the promise made at his grave had been broken, not by my mother, but by God's mercy. The sisters became my true family. Their patience, their wisdom, their quiet, laughter over shared meals, all of it taught me what love without cruelty could look like. Sister Agnes, who had been like a mother to me when I first arrived, grew frail in her later years. I cared for her in her final days, sitting by her bedside just as she had once sat by mine when nightmares woke me in the dark. When she passed, I wept, but my tears were not rooted in despair. They were gratitude for the love she had given me, love that had helped restore me. I knew that I could not erase my past. The scars would always remain, both in memory and in the subtle ways I still sometimes startled at sudden noises or flinched at harsh tones. But the difference now was that the scars no longer spoke of defeat. They spoke of survival. They spoke of a story that had been redeemed. Forgiveness had been the hardest lesson to learn. People often think forgiveness means pretending the wound never happened or excusing the one who inflicted it. But I learned that forgiveness is different. Forgiveness is choosing not to let the wound rule you anymore. It is laying down the burden of bitterness so your hands are free to hold peace. I never received an apology from my mother, and perhaps I never will. But I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. Without forgiveness, I would have remained, bound to her forever. With it, I stepped into freedom. I share my story now, not to reopen wounds, but to offer hope. Somewhere, there may be someone listening who believes their silence will last forever, who believes their scars make them unworthy of love or healing. To them I say, you are not alone. Pain does not define the end of your story. Even in the darkest night, light can find its way through. I know this because it found me. Sometimes I return to the cemetery where it all began. I stand by my father's grave, the place where my mother once whispered her chilling vow. The grass grows thick there now, the stone weathered by rain and sun. I kneel and place my hand upon the earth, not in fear, but in peace. Her words no longer echo there. Instead, I hear only the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet assurance of God's presence. The grave that once symbolized my greatest terror has become a marker of my greatest triumph. As I walk back through the convent gates, the sun sets behind the chapel, bathing the cross in golden light. I realize that my journey has come full circle, from silence to voice, from chains to freedom, from threat to peace. I am not the frightened girl who once trembled in the shadows of her mother's rage. I am Sister Lucille Warren, a woman who chose faith over fear, love over bitterness, and hope over despair. This is the life I was meant to live, not defined by cruelty, but by grace. And though the road here was long and steep, I would not trade the lessons it carved into me. For it is through brokenness that I found wholeness. It is through pain that I discovered purpose. And now, in the quiet of the cloister, I live not in fear of a promise made long ago, but in the freedom of a greater promise, the promise that God makes to all of us, that no darkness can overcome His light, and no past is too broken to be redeemed.